Welcome to Sleeping Radio Channel. Tonight we will drift together into one of the strangest and darkest stories that ever came out of the Second World War. We will talk about a ship that left the safety of the harbor and sailed not only into the ocean, but into the unknown fabric of time and space, becoming the heart of what many call the Philadelphia experiment. I will tell you today about a ship that left the quiet harbor to cross the borders of matter and enter the tunnel of the unknown. A war destroyer that set sail at the height of the Second World War, not to fight with guns and cannons, but to disappear behind layers of secret technology. A vessel chosen to become the stage for one of the strangest experiments ever whispered about in modern history. Why did the United States Navy choose that exact moment in the war to begin testing what they called Project Rainbow? And what was the hidden connection between the genius of Nikola Tesla and the theories of Albert Einstein inside this mysterious project? How did millions of copper wires wrapped around the body of the ship turn into a trap for time and space themselves? And what exactly did the sailors see inside that glowing green fog that swallowed the hull of the destroyer? How did the destroyer Eldridge travel hundreds of kilometers in a few seconds, and then return as if it had never moved at all? And what was the terrifying fate of the sailors whose bodies were said to have fused into the steel frame of the ship? Who was Carl Allen, this obscure man whose letters changed everything years later? And why did he decide to reveal the secrets through strange and scattered messages instead of speaking openly to the world? What pushed the researcher Morris Jessup toward suicide in circumstances filled with doubt and unanswered questions? And did the military truly open a doorway in time that they were never able to close again until this very day? How did some of the surviving sailors begin to vanish and reappear spontaneously in front of doctors and officers? And why were the official records of the crew quietly erased as if these men had never served on that haunted deck? What was the secret of the gelatinous substance that clung to the ship when it returned from that supposed void beyond normal space? And where did the destroyer really go after it was dismantled and its traces carefully hidden from public eyes? It is the experiment that shook the foundations of physics and stretched the imagination of scientists and storytellers alike. A journey in which humanity paid the price of curiosity just as it paid the price of war. The riddle that the Navy never dared to confess openly to the world. The Philadelphia Experiment. It is said that an American destroyer escort was prepared during the peak of the Second World War not to fight with guns and torpedoes, but to vanish using technology beyond its time. In an age when German U-boats haunted the Atlantic and threatened every supply convoy, the United States Navy was desperate for any advantage that could hide its ships from enemy eyes and enemy radar. In that tense atmosphere of secrecy and scientific competition, a project began that was known in internal files as Project Rainbow. Many believe that this project drew on advanced theories from the minds of Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein, ideas about a unified field where magnetism, electricity, gravity, and time were threads of one fabric. The Navy chose a new destroyer escort, the USS Eldridge, to be the test platform for this bold experiment. Around its steel hull they wrapped miles of heavy copper cables, linked to powerful electromagnetic generators, hoping to create a magnetic shield that would bend radar waves and make the ship effectively invisible. On a summer day, The 22nd of July in the year 1943, the first large-scale test was carried out in the Naval Yard at Philadelphia. As the generators roared to life and the coils began to hum, a strange green fog slowly wrapped itself around the ship until the Eldridge disappeared completely from the sight of the officers and crew. Watching from nearby, for a few minutes there was nothing but the sound of machines and an eerie emptiness where the ship had been. Then the devices were shut down, the fog thinned, and the Eldridge slowly returned to view, while the men on board staggered, nauseated, confused, and emotionally shaken in ways the doctors could not easily explain. Despite these alarming reactions, the military command wanted more. They ordered the equipment to be adjusted and prepared again, aiming for a cleaner, more perfect form of invisibility that could be used in real combat conditions. On the 28th of October in the year 1943, the second great test began, a moment that witnesses would later describe as a true catastrophe. When the power reached its peak, a violent blue flash flared around the ship. The Eldridge vanished not only from radar screens, but from normal physical space, as if it had been erased for a brief time from the ocean itself. Some accounts claim that almost at the same instant, the same ship was seen inside the harbor of Norfolk in the state of Virginia, hundreds of kilometers away. If that is true, it would mean that the Eldridge crossed that vast distance in only seconds, traveling through some kind of shortcut in space or in time. When the ship reappeared again at the pier in Philadelphia, the scene on deck resembled a nightmare far beyond imagination. Several sailors were found fused into the metal of the hull, their arms, legs, and torsos half inside the steel plates, as if their bodies and the structure of the ship had been briefly mixed at the level of their atoms. Other men were alive but sank into fits of hysteria and madness. Some were said to flicker in and out of sight, their forms fading for moments and then returning, as if they had not fully come back from wherever the ship had gone. The United States Navy reacted immediately by sealing off the entire area and enforcing total secrecy on everyone involved. Surviving sailors were moved under guard to remote military hospitals and asylums, where they were kept out of public view and slowly disappeared from ordinary records. For years, the story remained hidden behind locked doors and classified folders. Then, in 1955, a researcher of flying saucer reports named Morris Ketchum, Jessup began receiving strange letters from a man who signed his name as Carl Allen, and sometimes as Carlos Allende. Carl Allen claimed that he had been serving on a merchant ship called the USS Andrew Furuseth in the same region at the time of the experiment. He wrote long, confused, but detailed messages in colored ink, describing how he had watched the Eldridge dissolve into a glowing mass of energy, and how he later saw the mental and physical suffering of crew members who survived. He described how some of those sailors lost their grip on reality, and how others developed rare illnesses of mind and body that ordinary medicine could not understand. These letters fascinated Jessup, and later attracted the attention of people within the Office of Naval Research, who asked him to discuss a special copy of his own book that someone had filled with strange marginal notes about advanced technology and non-human observers. In 1959, Jessup was found dead in his car from carbon monoxide gas, and the death was ruled as suicide. Friends and colleagues, however, doubted that conclusion and suspected that his knowledge about the Eldridge and Project Rainbow might have made him a target for silencing. 20 years later, in 1979, a book titled The Philadelphia Experiment by Charles Berlitz and William Moore brought together many of these testimonies and interviews. This book argued that the government had experimented with techniques inspired by Nikola Tesla, based on the belief that matter could be transported through cleverly shaped electromagnetic fields. Officially, the United States Department of Defense has always insisted that the Philadelphia experiment is only a modern legend. In their public statements, they say that the Eldridge never took part in any such test, and that the ship was engaged only in routine escort duties during the war. Some historians offer a simple alternative explanation. They suggest that the real project was a standard degaussing procedure to reduce the magnetic signature of a ship and protect it from magnetic mines, and that myths and rumors slowly transformed this process into a tale of invisibility and time travel. Yet the story of Carl Allen, the unusual death of Morris Jessup, and the many scattered reports about erased records and missing men continue to keep the mystery alive. After the immediate crisis passed, the Navy is said to have launched a large-scale cleanup operation, scrubbing the site and removing every trace of the experimental equipment from the Eldridge. The remains of sailors who were embedded in the metal were taken to unknown medical facilities where desperate attempts were made to separate flesh from steel. Most of those attempts failed, and the men died in extreme pain, leaving behind bodies that were evidence of a horror no one wished to explain. The surviving crew who were not physically fused into the ship were transferred to guarded psychiatric hospitals under military control. Reports speak of strange behavior and of men who would sometimes vanish for brief moments in front of doctors and nurses and then reappear, terrified and confused. One secret report tells of a sailor sitting with his family in a public restaurant. As they spoke, his body began to fade slowly until he disappeared completely, throwing the entire place into panic and leaving only questions and fear behind. Before his death in early 1943, Nikola Tesla is said to have warned that using such powerful electromagnetic fields on living bodies would be extremely dangerous. He believed that these forces could distort the fabric of time and space, and that the human nervous system and mind were not prepared to withstand passage through those altered dimensions. After Tesla, the brilliant mathematician John von Neumann took over the technical direction of the project. His mind was fixed more on the equations and on the scientific gain than on the safety of the men who would stand on the deck when the switches were thrown. The special equipment was quickly stripped from the Eldridge, and the official logs of the ship were edited to show ordinary training cruises in waters far from Philadelphia during the period of the alleged experiment. Later, the ship itself was transferred to the Greek Navy and renamed Leon, where it served for years, apparently with no outward sign of exotic technology. Those who believe in the deeper story say that the vessel given to Greece was not the original Eldridge at all. They argue that the true ship was kept in secret bases so that scientists could continue to study its altered structure and the lingering effects on its metal. Researchers note that the timing of the October test coincided with intense sunspot activity and unusual solar radiation. They suggest that this may have interfered with the magnetic field around the ship and pushed the experiment into a region of instability that no one had predicted. Some later studies described the effect on the sailors as a kind of temporal freezing. The men were said to have spent long subjective hours trapped in a single stretched moment a condition that shattered their nervous systems and minds. Young sailors in the prime of life were turned in seconds into broken shells of human beings. Some lost the ability to speak, while others stared endlessly into empty space, as if their eyes were still seeing another world layered over the one around them. Documents that surfaced later suggest that the budget for this project reached millions of dollars, an enormous sum for that time. Such funding would not have been approved for a simple radar experiment, but only for technology that was considered revolutionary and possibly decisive. William Moore wrote that photographs once existed, showing the Eldridge glowing with an intense blue light. According to his claims, those pictures were seized by naval intelligence and locked away, never allowed to appear in public. The story does not stop with the ship itself. It extends to the strange fates of some of the scientists who supposedly refused to continue, working on weapons that could erase a human being from existence, not just by killing the body, but by scattering it in space and time. The Philadelphia experiment thus stands not only as a tale of a missing vessel, it becomes a symbol of the terror that arises when science steps beyond moral limits and begins to interfere with the deep secrets of creation. Over the decades, this story has inspired films, novels, and endless discussions. Yet the final truth seems to remain buried under coded documents, redacted reports, and governmental denials that leave as many questions as they answer. Leaked medical summaries from naval hospitals describe biological puzzles never seen before. Some sailors showed signs of partial fusion, with their skin seeping metallic droplets that resembled heavy mercury, as if a strange metal had begun to flow within their veins instead of blood. Nurses told of men who would suddenly enter a state of complete stillness. A sailor might stand in one place without moving or blinking for days, while his heart and breathing slowed, leading observers to feel that time itself had stopped around him. One of the most frightening tales tells of two sailors who argued in a bar after the war. Witnesses said that during the fight, a cold blue flame appeared around one of them, and his body slowly faded until nothing was left, while the objects around him remained untouched. William Moore returned again to the testimony of Al Bielek, who claimed to have been on board under the name Edward Cameron. Bielek said that the magnetic field had not only bent light and radar around the ship, but had opened a gap into a fourth spatial dimension that dragged the crew into a technological hell. He described watching his comrades scream as they sank into the steel deck, which turned fluid for a fraction of a second. He said his own mind froze, unable to process what his eyes were seeing as men slid into the walls and bulkheads of the vessel. Rumors speak of a secret file in naval archives marked with a code such as X9. Inside there were said to be photographs showing human limbs embedded in valves and engines of the Eldridge, proof that the boundaries between flesh and machine had been violently broken. The military historian Tom Barone tried to follow the later lives of more than 180 sailors, listed as part of the crew on that ominous day. He found that the civilian records for many of them seemed to vanish after 1944, as if they had never been born or had evaporated from the history of the world. Physicists who revisited the concept years later attempted to reproduce parts of the conditions. Their calculations suggested that exposing matter to a powerful electromagnetic field at certain frequencies could cause a kind of molecular resonance that weakens atomic bonds and may allow matter to lose its normal solidity. One story says that when Albert Einstein heard what had happened to the crew, he destroyed private notes related to his unified field work. He feared that these ideas in the hands of military planners would lead to further experiments in manipulating existence itself in ways humanity was not ready to control. Einstein believed that mankind had not yet grown wise enough to handle the ability to tamper with the dimensions of reality. He saw the events at Philadelphia, if they were true, as a warning cry from nature that there are doors we are not intended to open. In the 1970s, a man claiming to have been a radar technician came forward. He said that during the experiment, the radar screens had not simply lost the image of the ship, but had shown a dark hole that absorbed all signals and reflected nothing back. Other information circulated that when the Eldridge vanished, it did not only appear at Norfolk. Some sailors claimed to have seen strange cities and unfamiliar technologies through a kind of temporal corridor, as if the ship had passed briefly through a different era. Al-Bilek later insisted that he had seen himself in the far future, in the year 2137. He said that governments had used what was learned from the experiment to build underground complexes devoted to time, travel, and control of reality. The Navy continued to issue statements denying every part of this tale. They described Carl Allen as a disturbed man whose letters were a mixture of imagination and confusion with no factual base. Yet researchers kept returning to the same troubling questions. Why was the entire crew scattered, reassigned, and forbidden from any further sea service? And why were they kept away from civilian life until their final days? A book titled The Buried Secrets of the Navy describes claims that all the devices used in the experiment were encased in massive blocks of concrete and dumped into deep ocean waters. The purpose was to ensure that no one could ever rebuild the original configuration exactly as it had been that day in Philadelphia. In 1996, a retired sailor broke his silence and told of a secret base where he saw men walking through walls months after the event. They wore tattered Navy uniforms, and their faces were empty, like people whose souls had been left behind in another dimension. The suicide of Morris Jessup added another shadow to the story. It was said that he had been close to publishing a study proving that extremely high magnetic fields could attract objects from beyond the Earth, and possibly from other dimensions. There were rumors that men dressed in black had visited him in the days before his death. Some claimed that he was directly warned to stop digging into the past or risk consequences he could not imagine. Official records still present the Eldridge as nothing more than a normal escort ship. But the stories told by families of the missing and by scattered witnesses paint a much darker and stranger picture than any official report. The true horror of the story lies in the idea that human beings may possess a key to a door without knowing what waits on the other side. The price of such knowledge might be nothing less than the loss of our own existence, scattered as dust in the currents of time. Secret notes attributed to project engineers suggest that the equipment on board was not just simple coils. They describe 4 massive pulsed generators working together to create a rotating electromagnetic field designed to twist light and energy around the ship. The purpose of this rotating field was to bend light and radar waves around the hull, like the shimmering image of a mirage in the desert. But the result seems to have been far deeper and more dangerous than the designers imagined, reaching into the structure of matter and time itself. One technician who helped install the copper windings remembered that the ship was wrapped in countless turns of cable. He said that the arrangement resembled what some called a Tesla coil geometry, created to stimulate something he described as cosmic energy. At the height of the test, the air around the ship no longer behaved like ordinary air. It became a glowing plasma that tore at the atomic structure of everything it touched, whether it was steel, wood, or the living flesh of the sailors. Al Bielek spoke of mysterious black boxes placed in certain compartments of the vessel. He said they contained crystals that amplified the field, a type of technology that did not fit what humanity officially possessed in that decade. The surviving crew were described as becoming sensitive to what some called temporal radiation. They developed intense headaches when they approached even simple electrical devices like lamps or radios, as if their bodies reacted to the presence of any field. A book called Secrets of Project Rainbow claimed that a similar test was repeated years later at a desert base. In that later attempt, an entire building reportedly vanished and never returned, and the incident was buried under another layer of classification and silence. Other accounts say that the historical logs were rewritten to show the Eldridge on simple training runs near the Bahamas at the time. In reality, according to these stories, the ship was kept in a dry dock where crews scraped and polished its hull to remove hardened human remains. One person claiming to have been a military doctor wrote of the cries of the sailors echoing in the dark corridors of a secret hospital. They begged the physicians to return them to their proper world, insisting that they did not belong in the place where they had been stranded. They described a dark, cold region where they had been trapped during the disappearance of the ship. They called it a void between moments, a place without sound or light or gravity, where consciousness floated without any solid anchor. Some sources say that after the war, the American government brought in German scientists through a program known as Operation Paperclip. The goal was to understand whether the former enemy had parallel research into magnetic propulsion and whether they knew anything about true physical disappearance. Anyone inside the military structure who tried to speak openly about this subject was quietly reassigned. Many were sent to distant polar stations or forgotten conflict zones, far from journalists and curious civilians, ensuring that no detailed testimony would reach the public. Another idea grew over time, suggesting that the experiment had truly opened a temporal gate. Supporters of this view claim that some modern ships and submarines now use safer, refined versions of this technology developed after decades of study based on the sacrifice of the Eldridge crew. Even after 80 years, lovers of mysteries still visit the docks of Philadelphia. Some say they feel strange vibrations, hear distant humming, and see faint lights flicker where the original experiment is believed to have taken place. The truth remains fragmented between official denials and the scattered voices of those whose lives were shattered in the aftermath. For that reason, the Philadelphia experiment stands as one of the greatest scientific enigmas of the 20th century. Local newspapers in Philadelphia once received anonymous tips from harbor residents. They wrote of unexplainable lights and a loud buzzing that caused headaches for passers-by on those dark war nights. A young reporter at the Philadelphia Gazette tried to trace the story. Before he could publish, naval intelligence officers visited his office, seized his drafts, and warned him that continuing his work could be treated as treason in wartime. Unofficial sources later claimed that the government used strong chemical hypnotic methods on some of the sailors. The goal was to erase their memories of the green fog and the sight of their comrades dissolving into the ship. A historian named David Seaton wrote a work called The Forbidden Truth. In it, he presented a document from 1947 that spoke of moving the generators to a secret base in the Nevada desert to become the foundation of wormhole research. John von Neumann is reported to have said in a private session that what happened to the crew was not just a technical malfunction. He believed it was the collision of human consciousness with physical dimensions that do not recognize the limits of the human body. Carl Allen wrote in his extended testimony that some sailors who reappeared after the disappearance spoke in strange languages. They claimed to have seen entities watching the path of the ship across the temporal void, beings that did not belong to our familiar world. In 1994, an interview was held with a man who said he was the son of one of the missing sailors. He claimed that his father visited him repeatedly in dreams, assuring him that he had not died, but was trapped in a place where time does not move. Some conspiracy researchers believe that the controversial HARP program in the 1990s was a continuation of the same line of research. Instead of ships, the focus shifted to the ionosphere above the Earth, attempting to manipulate fields on a planetary scale. Leaked reports from former Soviet archives suggest that the intelligence service known as the KGB followed these developments closely. They allegedly tried to kidnap one of the scientists involved in order to learn the secret of physical disappearance. The image of a lonely warship sailing through a glowing green fog has become a symbol of the dark side of progress. In this symbol, curious officers and scientists gamble with the souls of innocent sailors in pursuit of military power. Stories say that some spare parts removed from the Eldridge continued to emit strange radiation for decades. They sat forgotten in military scrapyards, quietly affecting instruments and causing interference in nearby electrical devices. Charles Berlitz believed that there was a secret cemetery on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. According to him, the graves there belonged to men listed as having died during a training mission, all sharing the same date in October, the date of the second test. The endless details of this story reveal an entire system of deception. High-level agencies worked together to hide a scientific disaster that might have torn the laws of the universe if it had gone even further. The letters that Carl Allen sent to Morris Jessup remain a primary source for many of these disturbing details. In them, Allen used a strange mixture of technical language and vivid description to capture the mental state of the crew and the nature of the field around the ship. He wrote that the sailors who suffered from freezing were not simply unconscious. They were caught between life and death, in a condition no medical instrument could define, with heartbeats that stopped for hours and then returned without any intervention. Another book, The Philadelphia Experiment After 40 Years by Peter Moon, explored the link between this event and what became known as the Montauk Project on Long Island. Those later experiments allegedly continued to torture survivors in an effort to learn how to fold space and shape time. Some investigations tell that when the Eldridge returned from its journey, a sharp smell of sulfur surrounded the ship. Certain surfaces were covered with a strange gelatinous substance that did not match any known chemical compound on Earth. The historian Harry Shippern wrote that the Office of Naval Intelligence tried to persuade the public that the whole story grew from a misunderstanding of simple radar tests. But the testimonies of families whose relatives vanished under classified orders kept pushing against the official narrative. A signal technician recalled seeing a sailor step out through the solid metal door of the ship after the experiment. The metal did not open or bend. and it looked as if the atoms of his body had learned to pass through solid matter. Military health records from 1945 mention a group of soldiers labeled as suffering from incurable conditions. Their illness was described as caused by exposure to extremely high-frequency fields, and they were isolated in a place referred to as Facility 6. It is believed that confiscated notebooks of Nikola Tesla contained formulas that might have corrected the experiment. Instead, the project was rushed forward without fully understanding how deeply it could affect the human body and mind. Some sources say that efforts to reassemble the crew at the atomic level produced monstrous results. In one case, a sailor's head was found partly merged into a control panel in the engine room, still breathing for a few minutes before he died. Physicist Fred Alan Wolf suggested that the event might represent a kind of large-scale quantum entanglement. In his view, the ship lost its fixed location and became a pure wave moving through the combined fabric of space and time. Reference works such as Secret Time Travel. Experiments by Tim Swartz describe how the Navy allegedly used powerful anesthetic gases to calm survivors. These men were said to bleed from eyes and ears because of the extreme stress that the magnetic field had imposed on their bodies. The incident remains like a wound in the memory of modern science. In certain quiet circles, it is presented as a warning example of what can happen when basic forces of the universe are manipulated without adequate ethical or technical safeguards. In the end, the story of the Eldridge is no less frightening than any tale of fictional science. The difference is that hundreds of real families were left waiting for sons and fathers who sailed away on what they were told was a highly secret mission and never truly returned. Documents requested under Freedom of Information laws suggest that not everything was destroyed. Data and results were transferred into further classified programs, one of which was reportedly called the Second Rainbow Project, focused on treating the strange temporal dislocation in the minds of the sailors. Some of those men lived half in the past of the ship, while their bodies existed in the present of the hospital. They spoke of events that had not yet occurred and reacted to sounds and images no one else could perceive. In a book titled The Missing Files of Tesla, historian Oliver Knight wrote that naval researchers discovered a disturbing harmony. The frequency of the magnetic field used in the experiment matched frequencies of the human brain, leading to a separation between consciousness and the physical body at the moment of disappearance. A guard at the Norfolk base later recalled seeing men appear for a few seconds in the corridors. They wore old-style uniforms from the war years, looked confused, then faded again into a weak light, as if sliding back into some hidden layer of reality. Other accounts say that Edward Cameron and his brother Duncan were the ones who finally managed to shut down the generators by hand. They supposedly jumped from the deck into the field itself, traveled into the future, and then somehow found their way back. Cases of human spontaneous burning were recorded among people who touched the hull after the experiment. The metal held a charge that tore apart living cells on contact, causing bodies to ignite with energy rather than flame. In 1980, a motion picture based on this story was released. It is said that the military tried to block its distribution because some of its technical descriptions resembled aspects of the real experiment too closely. William Moore later suggested that the Eldridge was only a test subject. He believed that the core technology was quietly redirected into the development of stealth aircraft in the 1970s, where the understanding of how to manage fields around a vehicle was more refined and controlled. One scientist who also worked on the Manhattan Project for the atomic bomb wrote in his private notes that the Philadelphia experiment was technically more important. In his view, the manipulation of reality that took place on that ship was more dangerous to the structure of existence than nuclear fission itself. Medical logs of the staff who examined the victims were stored in lead-lined boxes. They were said to emit subtle but strange radiation that interfered with cameras and modern measuring devices, as if the paper itself carried a residue of the field. Carl Allen wrote that, in the days following the test, pieces of metal from the ship were seen rising and falling in the air without support. This suggested that local gravity had been disturbed, leaving a region where the normal pull of the Earth was weakened or altered. Debate still continues about the true identity of Carl Allen. Some think he was a high-level insider who fled the Office of Naval Research and tried to warn the world about experiments taking place behind closed doors. The date of October 1943 remains a dark point in the history of military science. On that day, it seems that every limit was crossed in the hunger for absolute control over the forces of the universe. The story often ends with a quiet warning to anyone who dreams of manipulating extreme electromagnetic fields. What happened to the crew of the Eldridge does not look like ordinary death, but like the breaking apart of human identity inside blind waves of energy. All these details together form the most precise and documented picture available of what might have happened. They are drawn from witness accounts and from the work of researchers who risked their reputations to pull pieces of truth out of secret files. Correspondence found among the papers of Morris Jessup indicates that in the 1960s a process called course correction began. The purpose of that work was to find ways to free human bodies and minds that remained trapped in unstable molecular states since the original test. Some of those poor men were kept in magnetically shielded rooms for years. Whenever they were exposed to ordinary daylight and normal fields, they risked either vanishing at once or falling into seizures in which they seemed to experience scenes from distant future years. A reference book titled Secret, Experiments of the American Army by Richard Dolan, notes that the scientists involved were haunted by chronic insomnia. They feared sleep itself, worried that if they closed their eyes they might awaken not in their own beds, but in some other dimension, as they believed had happened to the sailors. The hull of the Eldridge was removed from service and taken to an unknown location. Rumors say it was melted down in special furnaces, so that no physical sample of its altered steel would survive for later study by outsiders. One leaked report in the 1990s spoke of a magnetic clock device in a secret laboratory. It still pulsed with the same rhythm used on the day of the experiment and created subtle distortions in space around it for anyone who came too near. Carl Allen wrote in one of his last letters that the government tried to create electromagnetic suits for the sailors. These suits were meant to anchor them in this world, but they ignited as soon as they were worn, consumed by interaction with energies reflected from other dimensions. In 1975, a former sailor who had survived the experiment took his own life. He left behind a note that read in simple words that they are still there, they live in the shadows, and they do not die, clearly pointing to the comrades who had fused with the ship. Other sources claim that anyone who tried to recreate the so-called Tesla drive for invisibility faced heavy pressure from security agencies. Laboratories were shut down and projects destroyed under the justification of protecting national safety and preventing a new temporal disaster. Thus, the Philadelphia experiment stands as a living example of technological dread. It is a moment when human intelligence and military ambition blended to create a tragedy that will be told for generations as a warning against touching forces we do not fully understand. All the dates and numbers from 1943 until today line up into a chain of events that cannot be easily dismissed. The exact details remain locked inside the memories of those who have already left this world, taking their silence with them. We have now walked through the story and all its main aspects. We began with the scientific background, then followed the fate of the crew, and ended with the immense cover-up attempts that followed the incident. The sources that documented this event are a mixture of eyewitness accounts and the work of investigators who risked much to uncover what happened in secret laboratories and on guarded piers. Among the most important is the book The Philadelphia Experiment Project Rainbow by Charles Berlitz and William Moore, published in 1979, which gathered the letters of Carl Allen and analyzed them in detail. The researcher Morris Ketchum Jessup appears as one of the first victims of this hidden story. His earlier book about flying saucer cases was the reason he received the first letters that revealed hints about what had taken place on the Eldridge. Historian Tom Barone dug into Navy records to trace the movements of the ship between Philadelphia and Norfolk. He focused especially on the conflicting times and entries that seemed to place the ship in two places within the same period. On the scientific side, the connection to Nikola Tesla was explored by researcher G. Lowe in studies of magnetic propulsion. He argued that the theories applied in the project were decades ahead of their time and that they were never meant to be used without careful control. Another important work, The Secrets of the Montauk Project by Peter Moon, showed deep ties between the Philadelphia experiment and later attempts at temporal control. It suggested that research on time manipulation continued underground into the 1980s. Fate magazine published a series of articles in the 1950s. These pieces tried to follow the survivors and describe their conditions as illnesses that did not belong to this world. Serious scholars are also encouraged to look at files from the Office of Naval Research that have been partially declassified. In those documents there are references to electromagnetic testing carried out in the same time window as the alleged experiment. The testimony of Al Bielek at the end of the 1980s remains controversial but rich in technical description. He spoke in careful detail about the control rooms, the way the generators shook, and the sensation at the exact moment when the ship disappeared. All of these writers and historians agreed on one thing. They believed that the official silence was itself a kind of proof, stronger than any simple denial that something extraordinary had taken place behind the curtain. In the end, the Philadelphia experiment stands like a warning sign on the road of human curiosity. It tells us that there are locks on the doors of the universe and that we must be prepared for the consequences before we decide to break them. It is the story of men who set out to serve their country upon the surface of the sea. Instead, they found themselves trapped between atoms and waves in a technical inferno that did not care about courage, loyalty, or human life. The eyes of the sailors who never returned, and the cries of those who slowly faded away in hospital rooms, seem to follow anyone who reads deeply into this story. They remind us that behind every experiment there are human hearts and families who live with the results, long after the machines are switched off. Facts have been buried, documents burned, and the entire event pushed into the realm of urban legend, told on cold winter nights as a chilling tale. Yet the question remains whether forgetting can truly erase the trace of that green fog, or give back the sons who vanished into the tides of time. What happened during those minutes in 1943 will likely remain the greatest unanswered question in the long history of secret research. It whispers to us that there are boundaries the human race should hesitate to cross, even in the name of war or progress. Now, what do you think about this mysterious incident? Was it a hidden scientific reality ruthlessly covered up, or only a powerful myth spun from rumors and letters? Write your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you so much for listening with us tonight.